Okay, I think I'm good. That was quite a wrestle. So thank you for having me up here. Blake had asked several of us to share while he was gone, and so I'm happy to do that when I can. I will put a couple caveats here. I had hand surgery on my hand, and I hold it weird right now. It's kind of frozen, so if you see my hand sticking out there weird, that's why. And then also, I'm going to try really hard to watch my time. I'm sometimes long-winded, so I'm going to try to keep this short. But Blake did give us a kind of a guide to go on for what to share about, and so it was basically the words of Christmas to get us prepared. And I don't know if any of you use an Advent wreath, but that's something I grew up with and love. And each of the 4 candles has a name, and they are the candle of hope, the candle of peace, the candle of joy, the candle of love. And so those are the 4 words for these 4 Sundays. And Wayne shared last week on hope, and I was not here, but I'm sure that you had some words to go on there to think about how Christmas brings us hope. We sort of just passed these out as however it worked best in our schedules, so I ended up with the second Sunday, and that was that Christmas brings us peace. And there's lots of ways that you can think about how Jesus accomplished that, but as I thought about it, I just kept coming to mind the Peace Child. So how many of you have read this? Nobody? Wow. All right. Well, then you can review with me, hopefully be as delighted with the story again as I was. But for the rest of you, it'll be new, and it is a wonderful story. It was written 50 years ago, and I read it shortly after it was published. So it's an old story, but it starts actually 20 years before that with the author, Don Richardson, and he and his wife were new missionaries, 1950s. They trained, she got training as well as Bible training, but training as a nurse. They both got lots of training in linguistics to be able to go into a tribe that did not have a written language, and no one knew their language except very few people outside it, so they weren't going to come in with a translator. They'd have to figure out the language all by themselves, and that was a challenge. But they had a speaker come when they were in Bible college that had presented a challenge to them to come to the very newly opened field in what was then the Netherlands, New Guinea. It's a fair-sized island just north of Australia, and the Netherlands had colonized it, but just a little bit around the edges where they had some cities that they had ports in. Really didn't ever go into the interior. There were only Stone Age tribes there that didn't have too much value to them, and they were very violent. Boy, I have to be quieter, I guess. So not very many people had penetrated into these tribes, but there was a mission organization that was starting to work there, and they had come and presented this challenge to the Bible school there that had already sent out thousands of missionaries. And when Don and his wife Carol heard that message, they felt their hearts stirred that this was where God wanted them. So a few years later, when they had prepared, I think it was 1961, they arrived in the Netherlands, New Guinea. The missionaries that were there greeted them and said, you know, we feel like God has a tribe for you. It is the Sawi. And they felt again their hearts stirred. Yes, this is where we want to go. What can you tell us about the Sawi? Well, they are a Stone Age tribe. That means they had no metal. They had stone and wood implements and instruments and weapons, and knew nothing about steel or copper or tin or any other metal. They were very primitive. They also knew that there were about 18 villages of Sawi, and they were very violent. They didn't get along with each other very well, and they certainly were at war with all the tribes around them. It was kind of kill or be killed. And, oh yes, they were also one of those tribes that were headhunters and cannibals. So just the tribe you would say, yes, God is sending me there with my wife and my newborn son. But that's the power of God, that they agreed, yes, that's where they wanted to go. So we're going to shift to the Sawi point of view for a moment, and they had no idea what was about to hit them, but they had lived, as their ancestors had, for thousands of years. They knew the jungle. They lived in the swamplands. There were tall mountains in the middle of the island. There was ocean all around it. They'd never seen either one. You couldn't travel that far. You'd be killed. They were just in their little world, and they fought among themselves. This tribe had a blood feud, or this village had a blood feud with this village. You killed my brother, I'm going to kill your uncle. You killed my uncle, I'm going to kill your father. You killed my father, I'm going to kill your son. And it just kept going and going. So not a very pleasant tribe. I will skip quickly over the details of how Don made contact with them. But he did, and one of the rivers that several of the tribes lived along was called the Chronicle River. He went by canoe and motorboat to find that place. And I forgot to tell you, when I was telling you about the Sawi, that they had a little indication that something in their world might change, because through the jungle grapevine, they had been hearing about strange new creatures that had started appearing in the jungle. They were huge, stood head and shoulders above any of them. They had sickly white skin that they must not be very proud of, because they covered it in strange skins to cover up most of it. And their hair was different colored and texture, and their eyes were sometimes weird colored. And they were different in lots of ways. They had amazing gifts that sometimes they handed out. In fact, a guy from another tribe came down just to show off one of these amazing things he had gotten from a tuan, the big tuans, the scary tuans. He had a hatchet, a steel hatchet, and he went over to a tree and bang, 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 about 3 chops, and that tree fell over. It would have taken them 300 whacks with a stone axe. They couldn't believe it. Oh yes, and there are these other little things. What in the world is that? It's a fish hook, and you can put it on a line and you can drop it in the river and catch fish with it. You don't have to wait until the little tributaries sort of dry up and you can see and spear some fish in it. You could catch fish all year. And they had these little sticks that you could get fire from. They had amazing things. Ooh, well, can we get some of those? No tuan's ever going to come live with you cannibals. So I just wanted to show mine off, and he went on his way. But maybe that sounded pretty cool, but that sounded pretty scary too. So, well, we'll see what happens. Well, one day they heard a huge noise, like about 1 million angry hornets coming down the river. And when they ran into the jungle and poked around, here came, they didn't know, but it was a motorboat. Huge sound, and it had these great big white tuans in it, and they ran away into the jungle. But now I'm going to skip to where Don had made contact with some of them. In fact, along the Chronicle, there were several of these villages, and 2 of them were pretty close, and they sort of tentatively got along. And he was able to hire, paying out axes and tin cans and other amazing things, to have them come and help him build a house on the long stretch of the river, the longest straight stretch he could find where an amphibious plane could land. That was going to be their emergency supplies, and transportation was a missionary aviation fellowship plane. So he hired them to help him build a little house there. And then he left to go get his wife and child. So when he returned a few days later, he found to his surprise that those 2 tribes had suddenly decided to move next to him. And that was amazing. They had decided, yeah, maybe they'd try to get along, and because they both wanted to be near the Tuan and see what he would do, and that seemed a good thing. They built some quick houses. They mostly built houses 20 feet up in the trees where they'd be safe, but some of them had homes on the ground like Don and Carol had as well. So Don and Carol moved in, and they had a 3-day dancing and celebration and feasting. And they thought, wow, this is good. We'll be right close to them, and we can better be able to interact with them. 2 different villages, and dispense medical care. They had a lot of medical issues. And so this was all good. Till a few days later, like a week later, suddenly they heard a big noise outside their door. One morning they went, and here's a whole delegation of warriors from this tribe and a whole delegation of warriors, I should say the names because they'll come up later, from Hammon, I have a little hard trouble remembering these, from Hanam and Kamer. So you have to help me remember that. Haman and Kamer, they're headed towards each other with bows and arrows and spears and yelling. And the women were coming up behind with drums and hollering. And there was going to be a war right outside their door. And, oh my gosh, if one of them killed the other, now we're going to have to start a whole nother blood feud, and this would ruin everything. And so Don's like, what do I do? What do I do? I mean, they've got real weapons out there. This isn't TV. But he just felt like, God, I got to do something. And so he just ran out in the middle of them. And he hardly knew any words in Sawi at that point, but he knew S, which is enough, enough. And he just started running back and forth. And they were so startled, and they didn't want to kill him. So they backed off, and it's like, okay. And they made their way back to their villages, and a very uneasy peace ended. But it didn't stay. Every few days, they counted up that there were 14 battles, basically in their front yard, the first 2 months, and then they lost count. But no one actually got killed yet. Either Don would break it up, or someone from the tribe would say, hey, we got to stop this because the Tuans will move away. So they were just on the brink of being able to do this. But Don thought, oh my gosh, they're trying to kill each other now, within a week of when we've been here. I don't have time to mess around. I have got to learn this language so I can share the gospel with them and start some changes in this village, these villages. So he said, okay, I'm going to put aside all my plans to enlarge our house and to do these other projects, and 10 hours a day, I'm going to do language study. So he got some language helpers. For 4 hours a day, he would work with them, and he'd write down everything the words that he could figure out, and then the other 6 hours, he would just immerse himself. He would go, there were 2 different man lodges up in the trees. He would go to the one for Hanam, the one for Hannah should help me remember. She took me some notes for me. The 2 villages, yes, Kamer and Hanam. So he'd go up in the man houses, he would spend time with them, he would go out there and hunt with them, do everything so he could hear their language and learn their words. And he not only had to learn the word for man and tree and food and all this, he knew he needed to learn the words that would talk about the spirit life. What did they think about God? How did you express emotions? How did you forgiveness? All these terms that were a little harder than just figuring out what you call that tree over there. So he just worked and worked and worked at that. Prayed and prayed they wouldn't kill each other. So he began to understand what they knew about God. They knew nothing about God. They didn't have a word for God in their language. They knew about demons. Yes, there is a demon that lives in that rock over there. We put food out for him. Yes, there's a demon that lives in this tree stump over here. Sometimes we have to bring game or something to appease them. And if we want that demon to do something bad, we pay them to hurt our enemy. They knew about that and the dangers of the demons around them, but God, no, they didn't know about him. But they believed in the supernatural. That was something they shared with Don. They believed in the importance of a connection with the supernatural. That was also something they had in common with Don. After 5 months, he finally said, I think that I have enough language to start teaching them about God. So he went up into the man house, and he sat down, and he started talking to them about, you know about the demons, but let me tell you about the Supreme Spirit. And he started telling them about a God who created everything around them, who knew everything they were doing. Ooh, that sounded a little scary. But he loved them and wanted a relationship with them. Oh, some of them weren't that interested, but some were just bug-eyed and open-jawed of, whoa, who is this being? So then he slowly started telling them about God sending Jesus. And as he talked about Jesus' teachings and walking through the streets of Jerusalem and sharing with the Jewish people, they got really bored. It's like, oh yeah, that happened far away, and I've got business to do, and he really lost their interest. Oh, okay, so he just retreated for the day and thought about how he could share better, how he could tell them about Jesus. So he would go and try another time till they sort of tuned him out. And he would go back and think and pray some more and come back and try again. So eventually, one day, he got to where he was telling more of the details of the last week of Christ's life, and how the Last Supper, and how Judas had planned in secret to betray him. None of the other disciples knew about it. And this was a guy who had lived with Jesus for 3 years, and he was a close friend, Jesus thought. And yet he betrayed Jesus to his death. And suddenly they were up and they were listening and they were asking questions. How long did he know him? And none of the other friends knew about this. Woohoo! They started fist pumps and calls, and he's like, what? Wow, he was something. Jesus? No, Judas. And he's like, oh my gosh, this is going really wrong. And one of them stood up and he said, that was real tui asana man. And Don thought, I don't get this, but this is bad. So he just went down from the man house and started walking around thinking about, how do you share with people who think Judas is the hero? He went into his study and started praying, and he just kept thinking about that phrase, tui asanai man. What does that mean? Well, he knew what the words meant. It meant something that would be translated kind of like, as a pig to a man. What in the world does that mean? Well, it was an idiom. We use lots of idioms in English. It's something like you'd say, yeah, Hannah walks on stilts. It's a piece of cake for her. A piece of cake? What do you mean? You give her cake when she's done? What does... It makes no sense when you just look at the words. But we all know it's as easy as eating cake for her. So we understand the words that are left out there. He knew it had to be an idiom, but he didn't understand. So he grabbed one of his language helpers and said, you got to come talk to me. Talk me through this. What is tui asana man? And he said, oh, well, you see Hato's pig over there? Yeah. Well, Hato captured that little piglet when it was a baby, and he brought it into his home, and he fed it, and he tamed it down, and he got it to trust him. And then he let it loose. And the pig wanders around the village, but he's not going anywhere because he knows he can come back to Hato's house and get food and care. And he feels perfectly safe until the day that Hato's ready to butcher him and eat him. And the pig never knows that it's coming. That's what we do to men. And he goes, what? Still? Oh, yeah. just a few years before you came, Connie. Now, Connie, he was really good at this. He met a man from a village far upstream by chance. But he was thinking, and he said, we've been wanting to meet a man from your village because we've heard that your village is having trouble with the neighboring tribe like we are. And if we would band together, we could fight them off. And the man's like, well, yeah, that's true, but I'm not sure our tribe is going to, or our village is going to trust your village. Oh, yeah, well, if we could get it worked out between the two of us, we'd be big men in our tribes. We would be heroes because we would solve this problem that both our tribes are having. Well, that's true. That sounds good. So they arranged to meet. Connie had gifts for the man, and he complimented him all the time, and they got to be kind of comfortable with each other. So he finally invited the guy to come to his home, and the guy was really cautious and afraid, 1 foot out the door, but okay, everything was going fine. So he kept inviting him back till finally he could invite him up to the man house, and several men were there, and oh yes, they just fawned over him, and this is going to be great. And he met with them a couple of times, and it had gone on for months. So they were just getting ready to get the two tribes together, he thought, when all of a sudden it got really quiet in the man house. And he looked up and saw those men grinning and holding stone axes and spears and delightedly killing him. And then the whole village feasted on his flesh that night. And the language helper said, yeah, Connie, he's the guy. We talk about every detail of how he tricked him and how his face changed and he was so afraid. And we just laugh at that fool and we talk about it still. And Don's like, oh my gosh, these people are worse than I thought. They not only murder people, that is their delight, to be treacherous and to pretend friendship. So that phrase, tui asani man, basically means we're fattening you with friendship. How do I relate the gospel to a culture who thinks that is a good thing, who thinks that's a hero? Now I understand why they thought Judas was the hero. He's like a super sawi. He lived with Jesus for 3 years and had betrayal in mind. So he was just totally in despair, walking around saying, okay, God, I know that I can't just go in the man house and try to share the gospel again. It's not going to compute. There's got to be some other way to enter into their culture to get them to understand what you did, but I don't know what it is. So he goes home, he talks with Carol, and Carol goes, oh, do you think they're fattening us with friendship? And Don said, no, I really don't, because they don't have anybody else or metal hatchets and things that they want. I don't danger at this point, but they're all in danger, and I keep telling them, you gotta make peace, you gotta make peace. Well, there's no way they can make peace, because how would you ever trust someone you knew would turn every symbol of friendship into just a way to trick you? There's no way they can make peace. Their whole culture has been set up to distrust one another and to not take that seriously, to think it was worth more to trick and kill than it was to have the peace. Well, Carol assured him, God has a way. We don't know it. We'll just have to pray for the key. So that's what they did. For 2 more months, he just learned the vocabulary of what this means. I'm skipping ahead. I told you I might do that. Okay. He realized they couldn't keep the peace, and then he starts thinking, you know what? this is all bad, what we've done. We brought these two tribes together. They are not going to get along. We can't make them make the peace. While they're close together, they're much more susceptible to catching disease from one another. There's already a really high infant mortality. Now we brought them to where they're going to kill each other and start this blood war. We need to just not have them together. But now we've already started this. What we need to do is just leave. We know kind of where the Sawi mind is now. We'll move to another tribe or another village quite a ways away. We'll start over and see what God can do. So he went to the two man houses and he told them, okay, we are going to have to leave. You guys can't make peace. I understand now. You can't make peace. And so that's just would be best for you. Maybe someday we can come back. And they're like, no, don't leave us, Tuandan. And he's like, I'm sorry. So he goes home. Well, they had just gotten in bed when they hear a commotion out on the porch, and they go. Well, here's a delegation from each tribe of their headmen, and they're standing there, and they said, Tuandan, tomorrow we will make the peace. Well, I don't see how that can happen. Tomorrow we will make peace. Okay. So he went back to bed and thought, I don't see how this is going to work. But they got up the next morning. Everything was quiet. And then they see the people of Hanam starting to gather in front of their village. And one of their headmen has a toddler on his back and his oldest wife walking with him, and they're starting towards the village of Kamer. And they see the people of Kamer starting to gather, watching this. The father looks grim. The child looks untouched by it. He doesn't know what's going on, but the father looks very grim. And the mother is crying hysterically. This looks bad. So they get about halfway between, and suddenly the mother grabs the child off the father's back and runs back to her village. The father was caught by surprise, but he starts yelling and running after her, but some of the relatives start helping the mother, and they get back. He can't get at her, and he's ranting and raving in front of the tribe, but okay, what was that about? Well, okay, over here in Kamer, a man comes forward, and he's holding up his newborn son, and he starts a couple steps towards Haman, and he says, no, brother, you take the child over. I can't do this. So the brother takes the child, he gets about halfway, and the father suddenly says, I can't give him up, and he runs and gets him, and nobody stops him. They let him take the child back. Okay, but there's great tension and commotion in both tribes. Well, then Don sees out of the corner of his eye one young man from Hanam leaves and goes back up into his home, and he comes back down with his 6-month-old son, Beakaidan. And most of the mothers are hanging on to their children pretty closely now, but Kaio's wife is not too worried. They only have one son. That's not really an option. But suddenly she sees her husband has made it an option. He's carrying their child across the field. And she screams and starts chasing him, and he starts running. She slips off the path, falls into the mud of the swamp, and she just lays there and wails, and she is just hysterical. And Don and his wife are holding their child pretty close, and they're going, oh my gosh, is this child sacrifices happening? Should we go stop this? What is happening? Well, they see Kaio running to the Kamer village, and what he does is he says, here is the peace child. Mahor, you come take the child. He's now yours. And Mahor steps up and says, yes, I will be the advocate for Hanam. And he takes the child. Well, the first guy grabs one of his other children, a younger son, and says, here, Kaio, you take my child. It is the peace child from Kamer. Will you be an advocate for Kamer? And he says, yes. He says, run. So he runs back. Now they both have a child from the opposite tribe. All the tribes gather around, and they all place their hand on that child. And then the dancing and celebration begins. And Don is going, what just happened? So he grabs one of his helpers and he says, what went on? He said, well, we made the peace. He goes, what? He says, well, we exchanged peace children. And now there will be peace. And he said, surely you know that. I mean, how do you make peace? Oh, Tuans probably never go to war. Well, that obviously wasn't true, but Don was learning something that was hidden way back in their culture, that if a man was willing to give up his own son to another tribe, that was the only thing that could be trusted. Then there would be peace. So there was peace, but he kept waiting for it to get broken. So one day he was out on his porch and he saw some men from Kamer coming with spears, angry, and they're headed towards the Hanem village. And Kaio comes out and he marches up to the head guy and he grabs him by his earlobes. And Don thinks, oh my gosh, he is going to get his head knocked off. But the guy just stood there and looked at him and he said, you cannot do this. There is a peace child. Meanwhile, someone has run and gotten the little baby. And he says, see, this peace child is still alive. If that child had died, you would be free to do whatever you wanted. But this child is still alive. And I am the advocate for Hanem. You cannot do this. My hand is strong. So the guy's like, and he's wiggling on his earlobes. And he finally goes, okay. So he turns around and goes back. But he didn't have to just say, well, just stole my pig, and now you tell me I just have to go back and it's all okay? No. Kaio was the one who had the authority now to be the governing body for his tribe. He met with the elders of the other village and said, okay, we got a problem here. There was a pig stolen, and they think you did it. Well, they investigated all in a very judicial manner, and they find out, no, nobody over here has an extra pig or has been seen celebrating with a pig feast, but several people have attested to our enemy tribe has been in this area. We think that's who took the pig. And everybody kind of agreed, yeah, that's probably the explanation. So there was justice done, but no bloodshed between the two villages. Okay, so Don is thinking about this and thinking about this and thinking, there is an analogy here that we can use to explain who Jesus was. So for 2 more months, he digs into every detail of this peace child agreement they have and learns some new terms and languages. And he finally is ready, and he goes up into the man house and he says, listen, this is who God is. And he tells them about, you kept telling me we can't make the peace unless there's a peace child. I didn't understand, but you know what? You were right. God says so too. There can be no peace without a peace child. And he looked down at the warring world and said, I want to have peace with the whole world. So there needs to be a peace child. But I'm looking through the whole world. There's no child there that's good enough or strong enough to be that peace child. So I will have to send my own son. And the world killed him. But God raised him from the dead. So he lives forever as the living peace child. There's never going to be a time that the peace child dies and war between us and God will start again. And they said, whoa, is that Jesus that you've been telling us about? Mm-hmm. But you said Judas betrayed him. Yeah. That would be like the worst crime ever, to betray the peace child. You got it. And so they leaned forward and said, tell us more. So he did. Over the ensuing weeks, he started sharing about who Jesus was and what he did. And finally, one of the headmen stood up and said, "You make my liver tremble. You have aroused desire in me, and I want to accept the peace child of God." That cracked open the doors that became a flood, and in those 2 villages, more than half of the people trusted in Christ. Okay, Don is able to share with other groups. He's translating scripture. He's teaching them about the Bible. Till sometime later, they decide to have a Christmas feast, and they're inviting Christians from other tribes to come. And when they do, it's Christmas Day, and it's going to be so great. They've built this new building to hold everybody. And then the other tribes start arriving, and Don's like, "Oh, people are getting really tense around here." And so he is thinking, maybe they weren't ready for this. Maybe this isn't good. I'm going to read a little bit. Then it happened. A long Kayagar dugout appeared from upstream, bearing a patient that was near dead from pneumonia. A group of young men followed me as I walked to the edge of the croncle to examine the invalid. I recognized him as Hurup, a man I had had a few interactions with. He was gasping for breath as I knelt beside his dugout and reached for his pulse. But before I had finished counting Hurup's pulse, a voice, ominous and knife-edged with bitterness, spoke from behind me. "Tuan, you won't give medicine to that man, will you?" I recognized the voice as that of Amio. Looking over my shoulder, I saw that the speaker's slim brown body was trembling with emotion. "You want Hurup to die?" I asked. "Yes," Amio hissed. Anxiously, I rose and faced him. "Why?" "That is the man who killed and devoured my little brother. Tuan, I've been waiting for years for a chance to..." Now I was trembling too. The Christmas spirit was not coming easily to the banks of the Croncle that day. Was I really being realistic in hoping they would forgive their enemies for Christ's sake? Somehow, sometime they must forgive, but perhaps it was too soon. For a moment I stood speechless before Amio, praying for wisdom. Then an old memory stirred in the back of my mind. Reaching out with both hands, I gripped Amio by the earlobes. He was startled, but he did not draw away. He listened carefully while I said, "I plead the peace child." Amio shot back, "The peace child we once had with that village is dead. But the peace child God gave still lives," I countered. "And because he lives, you may not take vengeance against Hurup. Forgive him, Amio, for Jesus' sake." My fingers still gripped his earlobes. The conflict on Amio's youthful countenance raged to an almost overwhelming intensity and then began to subside. Soon it gave way to a glow of new understanding. The next thing I know, Amio was looking down in gentleness upon his dying enemy, Hurup. I released Amio's earlobes and, as my eyes became misty, said as matter-of-factly as I could, "Amio, I need your help to carry Hurup to the medical house." With deep resolve, Amio squared his shoulders and said, "Tuan, let me carry Hurup alone." 2 Kayagar lifted Hurup onto Amio's back and watched in awe as the young man bore his semi-conscious burden towards the clinic. Almost dizzy with gladness, I breathed a deep sigh of relief. It was beginning to feel like Christmas Day after all. So, you have enemies you have trouble forgiving, people who've really hurt you or someone that you love, and maybe, I don't expect any of you would go out and kill and eat them, but you might have thoughts of how much you'd like to hurt them, how much you'd like to say things to them that hurt them, how much you wish something bad would happen to them. And I just want you to picture that person for a moment, or people in your life, and see God step between you and grab you by the earlobes and say, "My peace child still lives. You cannot do those things. You must forgive, and my arm is strong." And again, we have to leave those things in the Father of the peace child's arms. We have to say, I will forgive. I will pray for them. I will carry them in prayer to a place they can be healed. And know that you aren't just leaving it to nothing, that God's arm is strong and he will provide justice for you in the end, hopefully by saving your enemy, but if not, by judging your enemy. Our part, though, is just to put our hands on the peace child and be at peace with our enemies. The other application I hope you get from today is just to see the Christmas story in a new light. That is what God did to bring us peace. And maybe hear some scripture in a new light. Hear Isaiah 9, verses 6 and 7. This was what was read at that Christmas Day ceremony by a Sawi pastor in his own language. For a child is born to us, a son is given us. The government will rest on his shoulders, and he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. His government and its peace will never end. He will rule with fairness and justice from the throne of his ancestor David for all eternity. The passionate commitment of the Lord of Heaven's armies will make this happen. Amen and amen. Thank you for letting me share.